I want you to close your eyes for a second, unless you're driving, obviously, and just try to visualize a number. 1 billion.
It's one of those numbers that's so big it almost stops meaning anything. It just turns into static.
It does. It becomes completely abstract, just data.
Yeah.
But we really have to try to tune into that static today. 1 billion human beings. As of, what, 2006? That was the number of people on this planet living in slums. And I was looking at the projections in the deep dive stack you sent over.
Yeah, they're not great.
Not great is an understatement. If we just keep going business as usual, if we don't change the formula, that number isn't shrinking, it's doubling.
Doubling.
2 billion people by 2030.
And that is the cliff edge we are walking toward. I mean, to put that 2 billion in perspective, because, like you said, big numbers just numb us, we're talking about a future, a very near future, where 1 out of every 4 human beings on Earth is living in an informal settlement.
1 in 4. That just stops being a marginal issue.
Oh, absolutely.
It becomes the main story of humanity.
Precisely. And I think the reason this deep dive is so necessary right now is that most of us, especially here in the West, we have this massive cognitive dissonance about it. I mean, when I say the word slum, be honest, what's the first image that pops into your head?
Honestly.
Yeah.
I picture the aftermath of a disaster, like a hurricane. Or maybe a refugee camp.
Yeah.
Something temporary.
Temporary.
Yeah, a glitch in the matrix, a chaotic mess that just happened and will, get cleaned up in a year or two.
A glitch, exactly. That is the standard narrative, a temporary anomaly.
Oh.
But the mission of this deep dive today is to completely invert that thinking.
Okay.
The research, all of it, is screaming at us that slums aren't accidents. They aren't temporary. They are established, they are complex, and in many ways, they are permanent features of how the human species builds cities.
That's that city within a city concept I saw in the note.
It is. I mean, look, we are witnessing the urbanization of the human species. That is the headline story of the 21st century.
Right.
And for a massive chunk of the population, a growing chunk, the slum isn't a glitch. It is the vehicle for that urbanization. It is the waiting room, the bedroom, and the factory floor for a quarter of the world.
So if this is the vehicle, we need to understand how the engine works. But before we get into the, the economics and the tragedy of it all, I want to pause on the word itself, slum.
Yeah.
It feels heavy. It feels judgmental. When we use it, are we already biasing the conversation?
We are, and I think that's unavoidable but really important to acknowledge. The word is incredibly loaded, and it's actually a relic. It's thought to be old British slang popping up in London's East End around, 1845?
I saw that note. It originally just meant room, right? Something that simple.
Roughly, yes. It seems to have evolved from meaning a room to a back slum, which was, basically a back alley.
Okay, so it was a spatial description.
Just a spatial description, that back alley over there. But very, very quickly, it morphed from describing the place to judging the people in the place. It became a synonym for moral decay, for crime, for filth.
Which is a pattern we see a lot in language, isn't it? You label the geography first, then you stigmatize the population.
And that stigma is dangerous, because if you label an area a slum, it's often a prelude to clearing it.
Right.
It delegitimizes the fact that people have built lives there. It makes it sound like trash to be swept away. But for us to have this conversation today, we can't just rely on vibes or, insults. We need a hard definition. And the United Nations actually has a checklist for this.
I have the checklist here. And it's fascinating because it's not just about, are you poor?
Yeah.
It's very structural, very specific. The UN says a household is a slum if it fails on just one of 5 conditions.
Just one. That's the key. And these 5 conditions, they really are the blueprint of the struggle. Why don't you walk us through them? Because each one represents a specific failure of planning.
Okay, so number 1, access to improved water.
Which means water that is safe, affordable, and actually accessible without, walking 3 miles or queuing for 4 hours every morning.
Right. Number 2, access to improved sanitation.
So, toilets, sewage, the basic hygiene infrastructure that stops a city from becoming a massive disease vector.
Number 3 is overcrowding, so not having sufficient living area.
And this one is brutal. If you have 5 people sleeping in a room that was designed for 1, you are technically in a slum condition, regardless of how nice the building is on the outside. It's about the density and the stress that puts on a human being.
Yeah. Okay, number 4, housing durability. Is the roof going to fly off in a storm? Is the wall made of cardboard?
Basic structural integrity.
And number 5, this is the one that really stood out to me, security of tenure.
Ah, that is the invisible one.
It's the right to stay, basically. Is that what it means?
It's the protection against forced eviction. I mean, just imagine living in a house where, deep down, that at any moment a bulldozer could show up and you would have zero legal recourse.
Man.
That psychological weight, that is a defining feature of a slum. If you don't have the legal right to exist there, why would you ever invest in fixing the roof? Why would you build a better toilet?
Because it could all be gone tomorrow. It creates this trap of short-termism. You're forced to live day to day.
That's the tragedy. The insecurity breeds the physical decay. And while slum is the English label we're using, I love looking at the global vocabulary for this because it just proves how universal the experience is.
Right.
The words themselves tell the story of how these places are built.
Oh, the list of names is poetic in a really dark way. You have the favela in Brazil, of course, the barrio in Venezuela.
In Turkey, they call it gisekendu, and this is one of my favorites for what it reveals about the legal loopholes.
What does that mean?
It literally translates to built overnight.
That is such a vivid image. It captures the speed of it, but also the stealth.
It captures the desperation and the loophole in Ottoman law and later in Turkish tradition. If you could build a structure between sunset and sunrise and get a roof on it.
A roof on it by morning.
The authorities couldn't just tear it down immediately. They needed a court order. So entire neighborhoods were literally gisekendu built overnight by communities racing to beat the sun.
That is incredible human ingenuity. It's like hacking the legal code with carpentry.
It is. And then in France and Francophone Africa, you have the bidonville. Bidon means a tin can or a metal drum.
So Tin Can Town.
A town of tin cans. It tells you exactly what the architecture is made of. Flattened oil drums, scrap metal. It highlights the recycling, the resourcefulness of it.
It really drives home that this isn't a local issue, it's a human issue. It's what humans do when they need shelter, and the system offers them absolutely nothing. And actually, that segues perfectly into the history, because I think we have this bias where we assume slums are something that happens over there, in the global south.
Yeah.
But if we rewind the clock.
If you rewind to the 19th century, the global south conditions were right here in the west. I mean, London, New York, Paris, they were the original mega slums. We tend to forget that the whole Dickensian world wasn't fiction, it was reporting.
I was reading the descriptions of Victorian London in the source material, and honestly, they make Oliver Twist look like a sanitized documentary.
Oh, it was horrific. You have to remember, this was the Industrial Revolution. The engines of industry were turning, and they needed bodies. People were pouring into London from the countryside, but the housing just wasn't there.
So what happened?
The wealthy fled the center. This is the beginning of suburban flight. And the poor crammed into these rotting post-medieval streetscapes.
There was this quote from Friedrich Engels. He called them cattle sheds for human beings.
Engels did not mince words. He was walking these streets. He was seeing the degradation firsthand. But the description that always sticks with me is from Cardinal Wiseman. He wrote about an area in Westminster, right near the Abbey, the seat of religious power, and he called it the Devil's Acre.
The Devil's Acre. That sounds like something out of a horror movie.
It was a horror movie. He described it as a labyrinth of lanes. He talked about nests of ignorance and vice where the atmosphere was typhus and the ventilation was cholera.
Wow.
And this wasn't on the outskirts of town where nobody looked. This was the heart of the empire. You could probably smell the Devil's Acre from the Houses of Parliament.
And across the Atlantic, New York wasn't doing any better. In fact, in some ways, it was even wilder.
New York was the frontier of the slum. If you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, you know about the 5 points.
Right.
That was the first true American slum popping up around 1825. And the geography of it, it tells you everything about why slums form, where they form. Do you know where it was built?
It was built on a lake, wasn't it? Or a pond?
The Collect Pond. But not just, a nice pond. It was a body of water where slaughterhouses and tanneries had been dumping their awful chemicals and blood for decades.
Lovely. So a toxic swamp.
A toxic swamp right in the middle of Manhattan. So the city decides to fill in this toxic soup with landfill to create real estate. But they do a rush job. The drainage is broken.
Of course.
So they build houses on top of it, and immediately the houses start sinking. They start shifting. The basements fill with this toxic sludge oozing up from below.
And that's where the poorest people, the freed slaves, the Irish immigrants fleeing the famine, that's where they ended up.
Exactly. It became this dense, sinking, chaotic melting pot. It was bad land, and that is a rule of real estate that holds true to this day. The poor end up on the land that nobody else wants. If the land is sinking, if it smells, if it's dangerous, that's where the slum takes root.
So here is the million-dollar question. If London and New York were absolute hellscapes in 1850, why aren't they now? I mean, we still have poverty in New York, sure, and we have homelessness, but we don't have Gisacondas made of tin cans sinking into toxic sludge in the middle of Manhattan. What changed?
Well, we tend to think they just got rich over time, but it wasn't that simple. It was actually very deliberate, very aggressive policy. Between, say, the 1960s and 70s, the West essentially engineered the slum out of existence.
So what were the levers they pulled?
Two main levers. First, massive investment in public transit. The London Underground, the New York subway, this was revolutionary.
How does a train fix a slum?
It allowed people to live further out where land was cheaper and commute in for work. You didn't have to sleep next to the factory anymore. You could live in a borough and take a train.
So the subway effectively expanded the available land for the poor.
It democratized geography. And the second lever was public housing. The government finally stepped in a huge way. They cleared the slums, often brutally, we have to admit, but they replaced them with council housing, with projects, with subsidized apartments. They changed the supply equation.
So they literally built their way out of it with concrete and rails.
They did. But here is the tragic irony. Just as the West was solving its slum problem using these tools, the phenomenon was migrating. It was exploding in the global South Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and the scale there, it makes 5 Points look like a quaint little village.
I read about places in the Central African Republic where the statistic is 95.9%.
95.9% of the urban population living in slum conditions.
At that point, the slum isn't a neighborhood in the city.
No.
The slum is the city.
That is the terrifying distinction. In those contexts, formal housing is the anomaly. The slum is the standard.
So we've established what they are and where they came from historically. But we need to get to the why. Why are millions and millions of people leaving the countryside to move into a sinking house on a toxic landfill? What is the engine driving this massive migration?
Well, it's the classic economic push and pull. But the push has changed dramatically. Historically, people left farms because they wanted to. Now they leave because they have to.
Right, mechanization of agriculture.
Exactly. A single tractor can do the work of 100 men. So agriculture produces more food, but far, far fewer jobs. At the same time, rural populations are still growing. So you have this huge surplus of people with absolutely no way to survive in the village.
So the village is effectively evicting them.
The economy of the village is evicting them. So they look to the city. And the city, it promises jobs. It promises better schools. And interestingly, even a slum school is often perceived as better than what's available in a remote, forgotten village.
I saw a stat from Surabaya, Indonesia that really backed this up. Something like 95.8% of migrants said they moved specifically for jobs. It's not about lifestyle. It's about survival. Pure economics.
It is. But here's the thing that's so important to understand. They don't just move to the city as an abstract idea, they move to people. Migration always follows social networks.
The chain migration concept.
Right. You go where your cousin is. You go where your uncle is. And if your uncle lives in a slum because that's all he can afford, well, that's where you land. You sleep on his floor until you can build your own shack next door. It creates this chain reaction that concentrates poverty in very specific areas.
And while all this is happening, there's also this issue of the government just not seeing it coming, or maybe choosing not to see it.
That is the massive gap between urbanization and planning. Urbanization is this powerful bottom-up force people flood in, but local governments often lack the funds or the expertise or, frankly, the political will to manage it. Or worse, they choose blindness.
You mean the concept of invisible land?
It's a willful delusion. There are documented cases where governments have official maps where a sprawling slum is labeled as undeveloped or empty or forest.
They just pretend it's not there.
And if it's not on the official map, they don't have to provide services. They don't have to pick up the trash. They don't have to provide water. It's a way of abdicating all responsibility.
But there was one point in the research that really stood out to me, and I think this is the key to understanding why slums look the way they do. It was this idea that labor is the primary architect of the slum.
This is a crucial insight, and it's largely coming from more recent ethnographic research, particularly a study from 2017. We have this image of slums as chaotic and random. Oh, they just built a shack wherever.
Right, disorganized.
But this research suggests that form follows function in a very deliberate way. The houses, the alleys, the whole layout is self-constructed specifically to facilitate work.
Can you give us an example? Because that sounds a little abstract.
Okay, let's look at a specific story. Take the case of a favela in Machio, Brazil, called Favela Sururu de Capote. It was started by dismissed sugarcane workers who migrated to the city. They were desperate for work.
Okay, so they need an income, first and foremost.
Right. And they chose a very specific terrain, the banks of a lagoon. Now, a city planner would look at that and say, that's flood-prone, that's unstable, that's dangerous. But the workers looked at it and saw gold. Or rather, they saw mussels.
Mussels.
The lagoon was full of suru mussels. And it turned out that 80% of the residents ended up making their living from mussel fishing. So they built their homes right on the banks to be close to the boats. They built the alleys just wide enough to carry baskets of shells. The slum was actually a perfectly adapted factory for their specific livelihood.
So it wasn't just housing, it was an industrial complex.
Exactly. Now, here is where the story gets tragic. The government comes in and says, these poor people are living in squalor, we must save them. So they initiate a resettlement program. They move the entire community to formal housing. Nice, clean, concrete blocks.
It's good on paper.
But it was miles away from the lagoon.
Oh no.
Yeah.
What happened?
The community's economy collapsed. They couldn't fish anymore. The architecture of the new apartment blocks didn't allow for shucking mussels in the living room. It smells. It's messy. It clogs the plumbing. The solution completely destroyed their economy.
They solved the housing problem, but they created a livelihood problem.
They destroyed it. And that is such a powerful example of how top-down planning completely misses the point. They saw poor people, but they didn't see workers. They didn't understand that the slum was a tool for survival.
And we can't ignore the historical roots of this, particularly colonialism. Many of the biggest slums in the global south aren't accidental. They are the direct legacy of segregation.
Absolutely. Nairobi is a prime example. It was created by Europeans essentially as a depot for the railroad. They viewed Africans as temporary migrants.
So they needed their labor, but they didn't want them as neighbor.
Exactly. So they didn't build neighborhoods for them. They provided bed spaces. That was the official term. Just a place for a single man to sleep before going back to work.
But people have families. People have lives. They don't want to be temporary.
Well, of course not. So they built their own homes on the margins illegally. And that was the start of places like Kibera.
And Mumbai.
Yeah.
The story of Dharavi is similar, isn't it?
Dharavi, which is now one of the most famous slums in the world, you probably know it from the movie Slumdog Millionaire, has an almost identical origin story. In 1887, the British colonial government expelled all the tanneries and other noxious industries from the city center.
The classic NMB approach. Not in my backyard.
Exactly. They said, go do your smelly leather work on the northern fringe of the city. That fringe was Dharavi. They provided no infrastructure, no water, no sewers. They just said, go. So the workers moved there, built shacks around the tanneries, and a century later, it's a mega slum of 1 million people.
It's just amazing and depressing how a decision made 150 years ago by a colonial officer can dictate where millions of people live today.
It creates a path dependency. Once a settlement is established, even on bad land, it has a gravity of its own that's very hard to reverse.
So let's pivot to the anatomy of a slum today. If you're flying over a city or looking at a satellite map, how do you spot them? Where do they actually form?
Well, the first rule of slum formation is find the land nobody else wants.
The leftover.
The dangerous leftovers. You're looking for steep slopes that are prone to landslides, like in Rio. You're looking for flood-prone valleys and marshlands, riverbanks, right next to trash dumps or railway tracks.
We talked about the Collect Pond in New York being a toxic swamp. It seems that rule hasn't changed in 2 centuries. But why there? Is it just because it's free?
It's because it's free, yes, but it's also to avoid detection. This is what you could call the natural camouflage strategy.
Okay.
When a settlement is young, the biggest threat is the government coming in and bulldozing it. If you build on a steep slope or deep in a marsh, the officials are less likely to notice you or, frankly, less likely to care enough to come in and kick you out immediately. It buys you time.
It buys you time to establish that possession is 9/10 of the law.
Exactly. And then the evolution begins. It starts with tents, maybe some plastic sheeting, very temporary materials. But as the settlement survives, as the threat of immediate eviction fades, people start investing. They switch to wood, then to brick, then to concrete blocks.
It solidifies.
It does. And contrary to the chaos theory, it becomes highly organized. An informal association, or let's be honest, often a local gang or a warlord will take charge. They act as the de facto zoning board. They might charge fees to newcomers for the right to build a shack. They manage disputes. It becomes a parallel state.
And with that comes a parallel economy. I think this is another thing people really miss. We think of slums as places of mass unemployment, but they're buzzing with work.
They are massive economic engines, but it's all off the books. We call it the informal economy. And to give you an idea of the scale, in a country like Benin, slum dwellers make up 75% of all informal workers. In Kenya, the informal sector is estimated to be 42% of the entire GDP.
42%. That's nearly half the economy running without contracts, without taxes, without any regulation.
Correct. And the work varies wildly. You have the illicit informal work.
So the legal stuff, just done illegally.
Right. Street vending, domestic work, and crucially, recycling. Slums are often the recycling plants of the entire city. People collecting plastic, sorting metal. It's dirty, dangerous work, but it keeps the city clean. You also have things like product assembly, embroidery.
And then there's the illicit side.
The shadow markets. Drug trafficking, brewing moonshine like changa in Kenya, which is incredibly potent and very dangerous producing fake goods.
The knockoff designer bags you see in markets.
Exactly. But whether it's illicit or illicit, the trap is the same. There are no contracts, no labor rights, no safety goggles, and often you have to pay bribes to the police or local officials just to keep working. It's a very, very vulnerable existence.
That vulnerability leads us right into the day-to-day human experience. We can talk about economics and systems all day, but what is it actually like to wake up there? We mentioned lack of infrastructure, but there was one concept in the notes called the water paradox that I need you to explain, because the math just doesn't seem to make sense.
It is deeply, deeply unfair, and it defies all standard market logic. The paradox is that the poor often pay far more for water per liter than the rich.
How is that even possible? Usually, if you're rich, you buy the premium stuff, and it costs more.
Think about the delivery mechanism. If you are in a formal, wealthy neighborhood, you have a pipe connected directly to your house. You turn a tap, water comes out. You pay the municipal rate, which is usually subsidized by the state to keep voters happy. It's cheap.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, if you live in a slum, there are no pipes. The utility company doesn't serve you, so how do you get water? You have to buy it from a private vendor, someone who trucks it in or carries it in jerry cans on a handcart.
So you're paying for the manual labor of delivery.
You're paying for the labor, you're paying for the transport, and you're paying for the profit margin of the middleman. Plus, you can't buy in bulk because you have nowhere to store it, so you buy small amounts daily. The markup can be astronomical, sometimes 10 to 20 times what a wealthy person pays for their tap water. You are paying a premium for poverty.
That is infuriating. It's literally a tax on being poor. And there's a sanitation issue. We mentioned overcrowding, but let's really paint that picture.
It's a crisis of density. In a slum in Kolkata, India, you might have 10 people sharing a single room of 45 square meters. Now imagine the bathroom situation for that building. In Kibera, in Nairobi, the population density is roughly 2,000 people per hectare.
2,000 people per acre. That's like a permanently packed rock concert.
It is. And when you have that many people sharing that few pit latrines, disease isn't a risk. It's an absolute certainty. Cholera, typhoid, malaria, they spread like wildfire.
And children are the ones who take the biggest hit.
Child malnutrition is just widespread. In slums in Mumbai and New Delhi, nearly 50% of children under the age of 5 are stunted. That means their bodies and their brains aren't developing properly. And it's not just about not having enough food, it's about something called environmental enteropathy. The constant assault of fecal bacteria from the environment prevents their guts from absorbing nutrients, so even if they eat, they effectively starve.
And if you get sick, can you call an ambulance?
This brings us back to that non-notified problem we touched on. Many slums are not officially recognized by the government. They don't exist on the map. And if you aren't notified, you don't get a clinic, you don't get your health data collected. And crucially, emergency services often refuse to enter.
They just won't go.
Ambulances won't go there, the roads are too narrow, or they fear for their safety, or simply because the address doesn't exist. Third shack past the blue tarp on the left isn't on the GPS.
Yeah.
You are completely and utterly on your own.
It's terrifying. And on top of all the health risks, you have the physical risks. We mentioned the landslides earlier.
Yes. Because slums are built on that undesirable land, when natural disasters hit, they are always the first to suffer, and they suffer the worst. Landslides in Rio, floods in Dhaka. And often, disaster creates slums. Think of the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. The so-called temporary tent cities set up for survivors. Many of them just solidified. They became permanent slums.
And then there's the human-made risk, the violence. We have to talk about safety.
It is a very complex picture. We shouldn't demonize all slums as war zones. Many are incredibly tight-knit communities where people look out for each other. But yes, high crime rates exist in some slums, and they're often driven by those illicit economies we talked about. The drugs, the gambling, and the gang wars that come with controlling that territory.
And specifically, the risk to women.
Gender-based violence is a massive, and I would say structural risk. I mean, imagine if you don't have a toilet in your home. You have to use a shared public toilet down a dark, unlit alley 200 meters away.
And you have to go in the middle of the night.
Exactly. Women are at an extremely high risk of assault, just trying to use the bathroom at night. It's a spatial design that enables violence. And because of the immense economic stress men unable to find work, everyone living in cramped conditions, domestic violence is often exacerbated.
And going to the police isn't really a viable option, is it?
Often, no. The police are viewed with deep, deep distrust. Residents fear that if they call the police, it will just lead to harassment, demands for bribes, or even worse, it could trigger an eviction. So crimes go unreported, and the cycle of violence just continues.
It feels like such an intractable problem. Every single layer we peel back just reveals another layer of difficulty. But we have to talk about solutions. Governments have been trying to fix slums for over a century. What have they tried, and what actually works? Because surely we've learned something since Victorian London.
We have certainly learned a lot about what doesn't work. Let's look at the four main strategies that have been deployed globally over the years. Strategy A is the brute force method: slum removal or demolition.
The bulldozer approach. This is illegal. Knock it down.
That's it exactly. Governments declare the slum a hazard, they send in the police and the dozers, and they flatten the entire neighborhood.
Does it work?
In terms of getting rid of the buildings, yes, for a time. In terms of solving the problem, absolutely not. It is a spectacular and cruel failure. It destroys homes, it destroys billions of dollars in informal assets capital that poor people have scraped together over decades. But it doesn't solve poverty.
And crucially, the city still needs the workers.
Right. The city still needs the maids, the recyclers, the construction workers. So the people don't disappear. They just move 5 miles down the road and start a new slum. It's a vicious, cruel game of whack-a-mole.
Okay, so that's a bust. What about strategy B, relocation? This is the nicer version where they build new housing, but usually far away, right?
Right. The pitch is we're going to build you a nice, clean apartment, but land is expensive in the center, so we built it 20 kilometers out on the periphery. We saw this with the Sabarmati Riverfront project in India. They moved 19,000 families, but they moved them to housing 9 kilometers away.
Which, in a city with bad traffic, is basically a lifetime away.
It disconnects people from their jobs and their social safety networks. If you are a maid working in the city center and you're suddenly moved 9 kilometers away, you can't afford the bus fare. You lose your job. Eventually, what we see is that many people abandon the new, nice housing and move back to a slum closer to work. They vote with their feet.
So that brings us to strategy C. This one has a specific name, right? The Turner method.
Yes, named after an architect and theorist named John Turner, who was writing in the 1970s. His idea was really radical at the time. He essentially said, governments, stop building houses, you're bad at it. The poor are actually great at building their own houses. They just lack rights and services.
So it's almost a libertarian approach to urban planning.
In a way, yes. He argued that slums were a solution to the housing shortage, not the problem itself. He said governments should just give residents security of tenure, a legal promise not to evict them, and then provide basic services like sewers and streetlights. If you do that, the residents will use their own money and their own labor to upgrade their homes over time.
The site and service model. Give them the plot and the pipe and let them build the walls.
Exactly. And it has had some successes. Mexico City in the 70s and 80s successfully urbanized many of its periphery slums this way. Medellin in Colombia is another famous example, where they used those cable cars, the metro cable, to connect hillside slums to the city's job market, integrating them.
But, I sense a but coming.
But the results are very mixed. In Jakarta, they tried this, and the conditions deteriorated back to slum status after just a few years. It turns out upgrading is really expensive for people living on the edge. And more importantly, it doesn't address the root cause of the problem: low wages. You can give someone a sewer connection, but if they still only earn $1 a day, they can't maintain the house. They can't pay the new water bill.
So is there a strategy D? Is there anything that actually has a track record of lasting success?
There is, but it's the hardest one because it requires massive political will and huge investment. It's the historical success story of the West. a combination of infrastructure plus public housing.
So we're going back to the Victorian London example.
We are.
Right.
There was a man named Charles Pearson. He was in the UK Parliament in the mid-19th century. And he argued that the problem wasn't just the housing, it was the transport. He pushed relentlessly for mass transit, what became the London Underground.
The tube saved London from its slums.
In a very big way. It allowed the working poor to live in decent, affordable areas with lower rent and still commute to the docks and factories for work. It broke the terrible stranglehold of proximity. But it wasn't just the subway. The governments of the UK and France also engaged in massive state-led public housing programs. Post-1955, the UK demolished 1.5 million slum properties and resettled the residents in subsidized council housing.
So it requires big government spending. You can't just hack your way out of it with a clever, low-cost trick.
Huge, sustained spending. It requires combining citywide infrastructure transport that actually works for the poor with affordable, subsidized public housing. You need to tackle both the connectivity and the shelter itself. You have to treat housing as a basic human right, not just a market asset.
It seems like we've come full circle. We started with the sheer scale of the problem, the billion people. We've looked at the history, the economic engines, the daily struggle, and all the failed attempts to fix it. So let's try to wrap this up. What is the big overarching takeaway here?
I think the summary is that slums are not an accident. They are not a glitch in the system. They are the predictable result of rapid urbanization colliding with a lack of planning and a global labor market that relies on cheap, informal workers. They are places of immense struggle, disease, hazard, violence, but they are also places of incredible resilience and frantic economic activity.
And the so what for the listener. Why should someone listening in a comfortable apartment, maybe thousands of miles away, truly care about this?
Because the informal is becoming the new normal for a huge chunk of humanity, we cannot pretend the Western model of the 20th century city is the only reality. And addressing this isn't just about charity, it's about global health epidemics don't respect slum borders. A virus bred in overcrowding can travel first class eventually. It's about economic stability. And fundamentally, it's about human rights.
It's about the future of our species, really. If we are now an urban species and the slum is the main form that the city is taking for billions, then the slum is the future of humanity unless we actively change course.
It is. And I want to leave you and everyone listening with a final provocative thought, something to really wrestle with.
Lay it on us.
There is an argument famously made by publications like The Economist that goes something like this. Good housing is obviously better than a slum, but a slum is better than none.
That's a tough one to swallow. It feels almost like an apology for the situation.
It creates a real tension. As cities continue to explode in size, are slums a temporary waiting room that we will eventually upgrade? Or are they the actual future of how the majority of the human species will live? And here is the real question I want the listener to ponder. We established that labor creates the slum people move for work. Can we ever fix the housing without fixing the economy first?
Can we fix the roof without fixing the wage?
If the global economy relies on this massive pool of informal, cheap labor, will it always, by necessity, produce informal, cheap housing? Are the slums a bug in capitalism, or are they a feature?
That is a heavy, heavy question to end on. But that's why we do this. A huge thank you to everyone for listening to this deep dive. It's a complex and difficult topic, but hopefully we've peeled back a few layers today.
Indeed. It's a conversation that needs to continue long after this.
Keep thinking, keep questioning. We'll see you on the next deep dive.